Welcome to this training video on inter-entity transactions. My name's Anne from Orchid Systems, and today I'm going to run through the setup needed to automate loan account entries between entities. Inter-entity transactions allows you to automate loan account entries between entities. It works within one Sage 300 company database or across multiple Sage 300 company databases. The due to and due from transactions are automatically generated when the GL batches are posted. It works on all general ledger transactions, regardless of their origin, so therefore works across all the subledgers. And it balances the entity transactions at a GL segment level. And this is what I'll be covering in this training video. Inter-entity transactions also allows you to auto-create AP, AR, and/or GL reallocations. It automatically allows you to create these additional transactions to automate complex inter-entity transactions. And inter-entity transactions provides for cash management between companies. It allows you to allocate payments or receipts for invoices in one company using a bank account in another company. You can transfer invoices from one company to another company for consolidated processing. And you can process bank transfers between companies. There's also an AR and AP consolidated age trial balance. The triggers and the cash management is covered in a separate training video. Inter-entity transactions comes in two editions. Single company, which creates the balancing entries between entities in the same Sage 300 company. And you have multi-company, which creates balancing entries between entities both in the same company and across multiple Sage 300 companies. Entities are defined by a segment in the GL account. In order to run through the setup and configuration needed for inter-entity transactions, the first example I'm going to do is using the single company edition. We're going to record an AP invoice and allocate 50% of the invoice to two entities within the same Sage 300 company. The second example I'm going to run through is a multi-company example, when you're selecting the entity by choosing a GL account belonging to the entity. We're going to enter an AP invoice allocating 50% to entity 1, 30% to entity 2, and 20% to entity 3. And the final example that I'm going to run through is also for inter-entity multi-company, when you're selecting the entity by choosing an optional field. We're going to enter an AP invoice and allocate 22% to entity 1, 33% to entity 2, and the remainder to entity 3. Looking at the example we're going to do for the single company inter-entity version, we're going to enter an AP invoice and we're going to enter the invoice into Orc Limited. 50% will be allocated to entity 1 and 50% will be allocated to entity 5. Both entities are in the same physical database. So the AP entry will debit the expense account belonging to entity 1, debit the expense account belonging to entity 5, and credit the AP control account. When this batch is posted in the general ledger, inter-entity raises the due from and due to loan account entries to balance each entity. So due from 5 in 1's books will be debited with $500, and due to 1 in 5's books will be credited with $500. In order to do the setup for that example, we're first going to activate the module, have a look at the license, and assign the visual process flows to use them in our setup. Then we're going to configure. First, we need to configure in GL. We need the segment which denotes entity. We need the required accounts, and we need source codes. Then in Enter-Entity Setup, we're going to configure the segment and select our options on the Processing tab. We also need to define the inter-entity routes between the entities. Then we're going to process an accounts payable transaction, post it in the GL, and look at the resulting entries. We're also going to see how to use the GL posting journal when errors occur in inter-entity transactions. To get the install shield for inter-entity transactions, you go to Orchid Systems, log in, select the version you want, and then find the programs. All the additions of inter-entity transactions, single company, multi-company, and inter-entity trade are in the same install shield. So you download one install shield, and the activation code will make more or less of the options available. After downloading, you would run the install shield and then go to activate the module within the required companies. All Orchid modules can be activated through admin services, data activation, and then selecting the module required. We recommend you assign the visual process flows that we have for inter-entity transactions, as it helps with the setup. Before doing any setup, we're just going to check our license and what options are available with the single company. The license screen is showing me that I'm licensed for single company. And in the inter-entity setup menu, we have the options, linked accounts, transaction routes, and GL triggers. So no cache management options and no entity database mapping options. These are the options that you have for setting up single company inter-entity transactions. Using the inter-entity transactions loan account entries visual process flow, the top half of the visual process flow relates to the setup and the bottom half relates to processing transactions. The setup that is required for inter-entity single company is the setup of the GL segments, segment codes, accounts, source codes, and the inter-entity options and segments and the inter-entity transaction routes. Inter-entity transaction works at a general ledger segment level. So the first thing you need to do is define which segment or group of segments that is going to be used for inter-entity transactions. In this example, we have created segment 4, entity. It is recommended when you're using entity accounting that you use the entity segment in closing. Then you need to define your segments. And in our case, we've got entity 1 and entity 5, and we're closing to a retained earnings account for each segment. Then you would need to go ahead and create the GL accounts that you're going to use for inter-entity transactions. For example, the expense accounts that you're going to use, the loan accounts that you need, and all the accounts that are related with inter-entity transactions. Although you don't need to add the entity segment to all the general ledger chart of accounts, it makes for easier processing if you do. So here we have the phone expense account, and it's closing to entity 1's retained earnings, and for entity 5, it's closing to entity 5's retained earnings. And you need to create a GL source code for the automatically inserted loan account entries. You then need to consider security, who has access to the inter-entity security groups, and you'd need to define for inter-entity transactions who can do the setup. And then we do the setup with respect to entity transactions. Initially, we go into inter-entity options and we define the segment for inter-entity that is going to be our entity segment. And you need to define the default entity segment value. The default entity segment value is only used in complex journals when there are multiple debits and multiple credits to multiple entities. Inter-entity would not be able to work out which loan accounts to use for the debit to entity 6 of $250, what portion relates to entity 7 and entity 8. In this instance, all loan account entries will be calculated with respect to entity 1, the default entity. And on the Processing tab, we need to turn on inter-entity transactions and specify our source code for inter-entity transactions. And these are the only two options that are needed for single company inter-entity loan account entry automation. The highlighted options with 2 asterisks relate to multi-company inter-entity transactions, and the trigger processing options relate to GL triggers, which is covered in another tutorial. And the final setup that needs to be done for single company automation of loan account entries is to define the routes between all the entities, that is, the loan accounts to be used between the entity pairs. In our example, we need a route between entity 1 and entity 5. We do not need to define a route from 1 to 5 and a second route from 5 to 1. We can do 1 to 5 or 5 to 1. We only need one route. Using entity 1 as the first entity, we need to configure the due from 5 in one's books and the due to 5 in one's books. We can use one account and let the sign or balance of the account indicate which way the loan is owing, or we can specify one account for the asset and one account for the liability. And then in our case, the second entity is entity 5, and we need to define the due from 1 in 5's books and the due to 1 in 5's books. It is not needed in our example, but in some scenarios where you do not have loan accounts between the two entities, in this case we do not have loan accounts between entity 2 and entity 3, what you can do is have multi-level routes. So in this case, if a transaction debited entity 2 and credited entity 3, the loan account entries would first be raised between entity 2 and entity 1, and then within the same batch between entity 1 and entity 3. And your routes can be as many steps as you need them to be. To demonstrate our setup, we're going to post this AP invoice entry for our phone expenses, where we've allocated 50% to entity 1 and 50% to entity 5. Posting this batch will have no effect on inter-entity transactions. It is at the GL level that inter-entity transactions comes into play. So if we open up that batch in the GL, we can see the AP invoice entry, credit to the control account and a debit to the 2 expense accounts. And it's at this point that when we post this batch that inter-entity transactions will automatically raise the loan account entries. And as you can see, inter-entity as transactions has balanced the entry with respect to entity. So due from 5 in one's books and due to 1 in 5's books. And if we drag across the source ledger and source type, we can see the first 3 rows was the original AP invoice entry, and the last 2 rows are done using the source type from the inter-entity options setup, or inter-entity source type. There are 2 scenarios where inter-entity transactions will prevent the source batch from posting. The first one is when the entry is unbalanced with respect to entity. In this example, the control account does not have an entity account, but the 2 expense accounts being used belong to entity, so inter-entity transactions does not know how to prorate or allocate this $7,000. When you post this batch, you will get an error batch as inter-entity is unable to process this batch. And you can see the reason in the General Ledger Posting Journals, Error Posting Journals report. And this is the error batch that was created. The second scenario when inter-entity transactions will not allow the source batch to post is where there is a missing route. In this instance, I do not have a route between entity 1 and entity 6. Posting this batch, we end up with an error batch being created. The error is listed here, but also listed in the posting journal errors. And an error batch will be created. You can use generate IET entries to simulate what will happen when you post the batch, but this process only works on ready-to-post batches. After making the batch ready to post, We can reprocess through the Generate IET entries. And opening up the batch, we can see the entries that have been generated without posting the batch. And if I was to go ahead now and post this batch, it wouldn't re-add RY entries as the entities are now in balance with respect to entity. And the final setup option you have as part of inter-entity single company is the linked accounts. In the linked accounts, you can define the mapped due to and due from loan accounts between the entities. So due from 5 and 1's books, and the balance of that should match due to 1 and 5's books account. And so on. You can enter all the map pairs in this particular setup screen. And if you do, it supports the inter-entity inquiries, where you can specify a fiscal year and a fiscal period and the currency you want to report in, and it will show you those linked accounts. And you can use this as a quick check to see that you're in balance. So the due from 5 and 1's books is 529,950, and the due to 1 and 5's books is 529,950. We have just seen the allocation of amounts between entities by using a GL account in a single company database. We have looked at the GL setup. We had to create an entity segment and this associated segment values, create the necessary GL accounts for the expenses, revenue, and due to and due from entries, and create the source type for inter-entity transactions. In inter-entity transactions, we had to configure the entity segment, turn on inter-entity and configure the source type, and create the routes between the entities. And we saw we could set up the linked accounts for the account balance inquiry. And when we post GL batches, we need to keep an eye on the GL posting journal errors. Thank you for watching this training video on inter-entity transactions, the automation of loan account entries. For more information on inter-entity transactions and other training videos, please go to www.orchid.systems.